Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 5 and see how this device holds up in 2023. Now, the first thing I'll probably tell you is that the iPhone 5, it was a great iPhone when it first came out. And funny enough, it was one of those iPhones that I didn't own personally, like when it first came out, but I saw a lot of people own it. I thought it sold pretty well when it first came out too, but this was a very interesting time because this was one of the last times Apple actually sold a single iPhone at a single moment. Since this iPhone, every single iPhone after this have sold at least like a multiple of different versions. So some would say the 5S only sold one model. Well, the year the 5S came out, they also released the iPhone 5C. And then with the 6 and 7 and so on and so forth, they had at least 2 iPhones that came out every year. So this was the flagship at the time, the only iPhone Apple was selling during this moment for that, 2012 model when it came out. So it was actually pretty insane. Now, I probably would not recommend buying this iPhone anymore, but if you want to buy some iPhones, I would recommend. Links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 5, this iPhone, which came out in 2012, it's approaching 11 years old this year, which is crazy. So when it first came out, it had a 4-inch model. It still is 4 inches, IPS LCD panel. It was a 640p panel, and it really wasn't that bad of a screen. I still look at the screen now, and it still looks pretty good. Now, to give you some perspective, when the iPhone 5 came out, again, one of the biggest issues and one of the things that people saw with the iPhones in general were that the screens were too small. And I think Apple felt that because this was the first time ever that we saw a screen increase coming from the previous generation. So we went from a 3.5-inch display before to 4 inches. But if you remember back in 2012, basically all, Android phones were just making fun of Apple for having smaller screens. And it was pretty wild if you kind of think about it. But as of now, that's not the case. Apple has some of the biggest phones you can buy in the market. And I think it's probably they have the biggest phones and the smallest phones you can buy in the market, which is kind of nice. So with the iPhone 5, it's definitely in one of those spots where, I'm glad Apple increased the size here because they ended up doing just 2 years later again. Now we still have the, Lightning port at the bottom too, and this was the first iPhone to bring a Lightning port, which is crazy. But if you take a look at all the technology, all the improvements that have happened in the last few years, it is crazy that Lightning is still here, and it was still here over 10 years ago, which is wild. We had the headphone jack here too, which is great. And on the back, we had that aluminum build, which was awesome. And you had the glass top and the bottom. Now, this was not a full-on glass back. I kind of wish they did bring a full glass back here. I think that would have been awesome. Unfortunately, they did not do it, but, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. And that kind of covers it up on the outside. There was no IP certification, there was no wireless charging, there was nothing really, any crazy cool features here, but it got the job done, and personally, I think, Apple did a pretty good job with this specific device. So, on the outside, that kind of covers it up here. Now, moving on, I will definitely tell you on top of that with the iPhone 5, the camera on this phone was pretty good. It had an 8-megapixel camera on the back. It was a wide-angle lens, and on the front, actually it was a standard lens, not even a wide-angle, and on the front you had a 1.2-megapixel standard lens as well. So during this time, I guess the thing to keep in mind with this specific device was that really wasn't supposed to be, I don't think, competing crazy well with the other Android phones during that moment. But I will tell you, even in 2012, this camera was very good. I remember some of my earliest memories of people taking photos of their phone or taking photos with their phone. This was one of the phones, and I think this was a really solid camera. And to keep in mind, this was an expensive phone at the moment, and the other Android phones during that moment too, I'm assuming the cameras were good enough, but maybe they didn't harp on the cameras too much. I remember HTC was really big during this moment as well, and there may have been already some HTC phones or some phones in the market that had more than one sensor. I remember there was this one HTC 3D phone, maybe I should get my hands on it, and essentially it was a phone with multiple cameras, but it was only using those cameras to make a 3D effect. With the iPhone 5, it was a good solid camera, didn't really have any crazy gimmicks, and I think Apple did a pretty good job with this device during that moment. Again, it wasn't perfect, but I think even now in 2012 or 2023, we can still see how good of a job Apple did with this specific phone back then. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now moving on to the software and the longevity portion. This area is kind of a given. I think we all know how this phone holds up now, but it did actually last a pretty decent lifespan. It started off on iOS 6. It got one of the most premier versions of iOS, that's kind of what we call it now. And iOS 7 was a big upgrade, but wasn't really too optimized for a lot of phones. But it did end off on iOS 10. Now, iOS 10 I think is a pretty decent ending spot for some of these phones, and I do think with the phones that did end off with iOS 10, or even some iPads that did too, it ended off in a pretty good spot. I think the iPhone 5, even now when I boot it up, even though I was making this video, it's still pretty crazy how smooth and how smooth performing this phone is. Now, I clearly would not give up any phones I have nowadays for this device, but I think Apple did a good job at optimizing this phone during that moment. And even though there weren't a lot of, and I would definitely say, Apple did a good job with this phone during that moment. Maybe it could have gotten iOS 11, but I'm kind of glad it didn't. But it is funny because the successor of this phone, the iPhone 5S, is still getting updates to this day. Although it's security updates, that phone is still getting updated all the time, where the iPhone 5 just stopped at iOS 10. I got a random update in 2019. In terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now on the performance side, this device has that Apple A6 chip inside of it with 1 gigabyte of RAM. Now the one thing to keep in mind with this specific phone is that the performance now is not what the performance was back then. The performance back then, it was a fast phone. It was the fastest iPhone of all time when it came out, And when you look at this phone now, clearly it's not that fast, but it's still fairly smooth. I mentioned this before, but I think Apple did a good job at optimizing their chipsets and using these really good quality chipsets even way back then, which is always so crazy to kind of think about. Now with something like the iPhone 5, it's a good, well-optimized machine. Is it perfect? Not really. I think a lot of people probably expect that. But I think when you kind of look at it, I always kind of said this before, the iPhone 5 is a very smooth device. And the reason for that is because of the software. If this iPhone ended up getting iOS 11, then that would have been a little bit of a different experience. But because it didn't end up going down that, side, in my opinion, I think, in my opinion, from that perspective, that, Apple did a good job at the performance side. But I will say with the 5S, the 6, especially with the iPhone 6S, Apple did a way better job on those devices. And that's not necessarily where this iPhone falls flat, but that is probably where the latest iPhones probably end up getting some of the weirder experiences with, in my opinion. So from that perspective, what I'll tell you is this iPhone clearly isn't worth buying anymore. But at one moment, it was probably a really good and fast performing phone. And that's kind of one of those things you have to keep in mind. So that kind of covers it up there. And the battery life standpoint, you had a 1,440 milliamp battery. It was a big size battery for that moment. But now, could you imagine if a phone even came out with less than like a 2,000 milliamp battery? That would actually be pretty wild. So from that perspective, it's just another one of those crazy things to kind of keep in mind. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is, I definitely do think that the iPhone 5 is a good phone when it first came out. It was a great phone when it first came out, but it quickly became kind of, not obsolete, but it quickly actually became kind of old when you kind of look at some other phones that kind of came out after that. So that's always been the thing that I've kind of kept in the back of my head of how fast some of these phones kind of age. And with something like the iPhone 5, we had the 5S that came out after this, the 6 and the 6S. By the time the iPhone 6 came out, the iPhone 5, in my opinion, already kind of felt old, to be honest. So in that perspective, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.